Dr. Rajan Prasad.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The first thing I want to say to the member who's just sat down is that clearly he is not an economist because he chairs the Finance Expenditure Committee. He might like to think that he is an economist. He's not, because he believes that only two things that that friend of his, the economist, said were important. But only those two things. Now, I say to that member, there are many more things a responsible government has to address, and it can't be just those two things. Mr. Speaker, that's the problem with this speech for the throne. This society has a right to look at the set piece speech from the government about its strategic intent, its statements of its aspirations, and find a place for themselves within that statement. This is a statement for all New Zealanders, Mr. Speaker, and one that we all should be able to look confidently at to see how the government intends to advance our interests, everybody's interest. So, Mr. Speaker, it's a fair test of this particular statement to see how it addresses the needs of all New Zealanders and how it reflects their point of view. Mr. Speaker, in the speech from the throne, the government states that its driving goal is to build a more competitive economy with less debt, more jobs and higher incomes. We should hold those three things in our mind. This was the goal of the government throughout the last 3 years. And here it is restated in a slightly different form, but it's the same statement. Over the past 3 years, we have not seen less debt. In fact, debt has ballooned under this particular government. No matter how it tries to explain it, no matter what reasons it finds, the fact is that the debt under this government has mushroomed. So it has borrowed like that there's no tomorrow. So there isn't any less debt, and it won't be for some time. We have not seen more full-time jobs because full-time jobs are down. No matter how they try to package that, the fact is full-time jobs are down. The number of hours worked is down, and 100,000 people need more hours to make ends meet. Maybe they don't care, Mr. Speaker, that some people are job weak in the sense they don't have the hours, and so they work less time, they don't have enough money, they live, in a sense, suboptimal lives. We have already been told in this debate that 83,000 people are not in education, work or training. How could that be a judgment of the aspirations and the performance of that government of the last 3 years? As for higher incomes, Mr. Speaker, that only applies to those at the very top of the income scale. Ordinary people have not seen any meaningful increase under the stewardship of this government, and the program it has outlined in this document will not do the same, not do it for them either. Now, tax cuts notwithstanding, that gave advantages to one side. So, Mr. Speaker, by its own statements, let's get more jobs, high incomes, the government fails. Mr. Speaker, this was the government that promised it would make the boat go faster. That borrowed that from the America's Cup Challenge. However, what it intends to do, Mr. Speaker, is actually sell the boat, because that ain't going to make it go faster. The government knows it does not have wide support for its asset sales program, and yet it intends to persist. It has no mandate. That has been well established. Because it won an election does not mean it has a mandate for this one policy. There are 2 points about the government's asset sales programs that need to be made. The first is to ask, when does a government take the views of the public into account in setting such a major policy goal? Does the lack of wide support for the asset sales currently reflected in surveys and opinion polls demonstrate to the government the level of support for such a radical policy is just not there? And it knows it's just not there. It tries to say it has a mandate. It doesn't. Clearly the support isn't there, and it has no mandate. Now, if it wants to test that, then perhaps have a referendum. Test that out. And we know that the majority would not support it. The second point is that there is no agreement that selling state assets that produce a good rate of return for the government currently is a no-brainer. It's a no-brainer selling that. So not many people see the logic of this policy, except perhaps those that will benefit directly from it. Many more will pay it through higher prices for electricity, and many ordinary New Zealand families cannot afford it at the moment, but the government does not care for this particular group. So, Mr. Speaker, the policy is entirely driven by ideology. This is the belief that the state has no business owning strategic assets for all New Zealanders. It will drive this ideology no matter what, because only its supporters are likely to benefit. So why does the government not govern for all New Zealanders? Certainly it's not there for the average citizen, and this does not benefit them. The same applies to the privatisation of ACC, in a sense, opening up those bank accounts. Charter schools, the same sort of stuff. Ideologically driven, the facts are not there. Mr. Speaker, clearly this government does not have a plan to meet its own goals of less debt, more jobs and higher income. When challenged about this last November, it hurriedly put together a 120-point plan during the last days of the election campaign. This seemed like a desperate act at the time, but somehow it was promoted as a new idea. I've had a look at the 120-point plan that many speakers opposite have spoken to. There are only 21% of the 120 are new proposals. The rest have already been completed or are underway, and many of them are not. It's a ragtag group of ideas that they have promoted over the last 3 years, put them together, and it's now a plan. This confirms, Mr. Speaker, that there are few ideas, and selling state assets does not constitute a real plan for growth and progress towards a smart, clean, clever country. Mr. Speaker, this country has already been judged as one of the most unequal. This is a terrible, in the OECD, this is a terrible indictment. But where in this statement is there a real commitment to change that, a real commitment to move much faster to make this a more equal society? There are a whole raft of anti-worker legislation, reducing their income. How does that create a fairer society? How does that play to create a more equal society? There is nothing in this plan that addresses our low-wage economy. In fact, the government policy is designed to make that even more difficult. I wonder how members of the government go to bed comfortably at night, knowing there are many others out there living lives of quiet desperation, haven't been fed well that night, the children are probably hungry and not looking forward to the next day. And yet this statement is their plan to address that. Those who are hungry and poor cannot wait. Mr. Speaker, one of the changing aspects of New Zealand society is its culture and ethnic diversification. There are almost half a million people who identify as an ethnic group other than Pākehā, Maori or Pacifica. They play a critical role in New Zealand society, and given the social capital they represent, they are well placed to make a difference, a real difference to this country's growth and well-being. But there's no reference to them in this particular document at all. These people are faceless. You would have thought that in the strategic statement from government to guide its 3-year program, there would have been a reflection on at least the diversification of New Zealand society and what new ideas this government had that might have addressed them much more directly. Mr. Speaker, this country has to invest much greater thought than it has to date in harvesting the potential of the ethnic sector. That is the new New Zealand, and particularly in Auckland, but other cities as well. Given this, one would have thought that there would have been some reference to the interests in this plan. So far, we have become familiar with ethnic celebrations and ethnic elements of ethnic culture like food and entertainment. But their interests in New Zealand are much greater than that. There has to be a much deeper level of engagement and involvement with the ethnic sector and with all New Zealand society about our ethnic diversification. And I thought that change is so important that in this strategic statement that would have been addressed. There has to be a greater level of dialogue with and regarding the ethnic sectors as well as with all New Zealanders. Mr. Speaker, we are all reasonably well informed about the plight of our children in this country. This document says very little about our most vulnerable. We know that there is a correlation between abuse, neglect and poverty, and yet this document is quite silent on many of those factors. There is a belief that somehow will trickle down to their interests as well. So, Mr. Speaker, in conclusion, this is a disappointing speech. It's a bland speech from the throne. It will not give comfort to the many who will reward it because their interests are not addressed. Instead, it will only advantage the few who are already advantaged. I guess, Mr. Speaker, New Zealand will have to wait for a Labour government to once again lift all boats through a clean, green and clever program. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Happy birthday, Ray. Happy birthday.
Honourable Phil Heatley.
Thank you very much.